I want you to think about the floor beneath your feet right now. The concrete, the tile, the hardwood, whatever it is. You walk on it every single day without a second thought. You have no idea what's underneath it. I didn't either. Until the day my contractor's jackhammer broke through the concrete in my basement and revealed something that made every single person on that job site stop what they were doing and go completely silent. I moved into a rental house in Bridgewater, Massachusetts in the fall of 2018. I was finishing up my final year of college, and the place was cheap, a narrow, two-story colonial on a quiet street near the edge of town. Old house. 1920s build. High ceilings, drafty windows, a kitchen that smelled faintly of someone else's cooking no matter how many times I cleaned it. The basement was unfinished. Raw concrete floor, exposed pipes overhead, a single bare bulb on a pull chain. I used it for storage, boxes of textbooks, an old bicycle, a mini fridge I never bothered to bring upstairs. I went down maybe once a week to grab something. I never stayed long. The basement had a feeling to it that I couldn't put a name to. Not scary exactly. More like the feeling of being watched by something that didn't necessarily mean you harm but was paying very close attention to everything you did. In January I noticed a crack in the basement floor near the far wall. A long diagonal crack that hadn't been there when I moved in. I mentioned it to my landlord, an older man named Mr. Callahan who lived 2 streets over. He came by, looked at it, and said he'd have someone come take a look in the spring. He wasn't alarmed. I tried not to be either. The crack widened over the following weeks. By February it was almost an inch across and I could feel cold air coming up through it when I stood nearby. Cold in a way that felt different from the general cold of an unheated basement. More focused. More intentional. Like something breathing. Mr. Callahan sent a contractor in March. A quiet guy named Phil who came with a handheld scanner to check for pipes and wiring before breaking anything open. He scanned the area around the crack, told me everything was clear, and started with a small electric jackhammer along the edge of it to see what was causing the separation. He got about 4 inches down when he stopped. He crouched. He brushed concrete dust away with his gloved hand. Then he stood up and told me to come look at something. There was stone underneath the concrete. Not bedrock, cut stone. Flat, deliberately shaped, clearly placed by human hands. Phil brushed more dust away, widening the exposed area, and that's when the letters appeared. Carved directly into the stone in the careful chisel work of someone who had done it a very long time ago. A name. A date. 2 dates, actually. A birth year and a death year. 1799 to 1836, there was a gravestone under my basement floor. A full, intact gravestone, laid face up just beneath the concrete, as though whoever poured that floor had known exactly what was there and simply poured over it. Covered it up. Sealed it in. Phil set his jackhammer down and called Mr. Callahan. I stood there reading the name on the stone over and over. Jabez Hardin. I'd never heard that name in my life. But I would spend the next 3 months learning everything about him. The Historical Society in Bridgewater confirmed it within a week. Jabez Hardin had fought in the War of 1812 as a teenager. He died in 1836 at the age of 37, and he was officially buried, headstone and all, in a cemetery about 1.5 miles from my rental house. Which meant the stone in my basement floor was not his burial marker. It was a second stone. A duplicate. Or something else entirely. No one could explain why it was there. The Historical Society had no record of a second monument being commissioned. The cemetery had only one listing for Jabez Hardin. Whoever had placed that stone beneath the concrete floor of that basement had done so quietly, without documentation, without any apparent reason that survived into the present day. Mr. Callahan sold the house 8 months later. He didn't give a reason. The gravestone was carefully removed and donated to the Bridgewater Historical Society, where it's apparently still in storage. I finished my degree and moved out in May. But here's the thing that has stayed with me. The crack in the floor, the one that started this whole discovery, had appeared in January. I had moved in the previous September. For 4 months, I had been living in that house, sleeping directly above that stone, going down to the basement once a week to grab things from storage, standing just feet away from it without knowing it was there. And in all those months, in all those trips down those stairs, I had never once felt comfortable in that basement. I had never been able to shake the feeling of being watched. The feeling of something paying close attention. I've thought about Jabez Harden many times since then. About who put that second stone there and why. About what they wanted to mark. About whether some part of whatever he was, whatever any of us are, was still down there in that cold, dark room, watching the crack in the floor slowly widen, waiting for someone to finally look down. There is a specific kind of fear that doesn't hit you all at once. It builds slowly, piece by piece, over days and weeks, each small wrong thing adding to the last, until the moment arrives when all of those pieces lock together and you understand something so terrible that your mind genuinely refuses to accept it for a full 10 seconds. That is what happened to me in the winter of 2021. In my own home. In my own basement. When I finally understood that I had not been alone in my house for a very, very long time. I bought my house in South Minneapolis in the spring of 2020. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, and a full unfinished basement that I intended to eventually convert into a home office. I was working remotely, newly single, and grateful for the space. The neighborhood was quiet. The house was solid. The price was reasonable for the market. The basement was accessible from a door in the kitchen. Concrete floor, exposed joists overhead, a utility room in the back corner where the furnace and water heater lived. I used the main area for boxes, moving boxes mostly, never fully unpacked because I kept telling myself I'd set up the office down there eventually. The utility room I left alone. I had no reason to go in there. The furnace ran fine. The water heater worked. I had a home warranty if anything went wrong. The first strange thing happened about 6 weeks after I moved in. I came home from a grocery run and found my back door unlocked. I was certain I had locked it. I was always certain. Checking the locks before I left was something I'd done compulsively since I was a teenager. I checked every door, every window, every time without exception. But the back door was unlocked, and the deadbolt hadn't been tampered with, and I had no explanation. I relocked it and told myself I'd made a mistake. The second thing happened in August. I came downstairs one morning and found a kitchen cabinet open. The one above the stove where I kept canned goods. Nothing was missing that I could see. The cabinet was just open. I closed it and made coffee and went back to work. The third thing happened in October. I went to the basement to look for a specific moving box. I needed a winter coat I hadn't unpacked yet. I found the box easily enough, but as I was heading back upstairs I noticed something. The utility room door, which I always left closed, was slightly open. Maybe 2 inches. I pushed it shut and went upstairs and spent the next hour sitting at my desk feeling a low-grade unease that I couldn't explain and eventually talked myself out of. November was when I started to notice the food. I was not an organized grocery shopper. I bought things in bulk, didn't track what I had closely, and often forgot what was in the back of the pantry. So when things went missing, I told myself I had eaten them and forgotten. A loaf of bread I thought I had. A jar of peanut butter I couldn't find. 2 cans of soup that I was sure I'd bought but couldn't locate. Small things. The kind of thing you dismiss because the alternative explanation is one your brain doesn't want to offer you. In December, I had a plumber come to look at a slow drain in the basement utility sink. He was down there for about 20 minutes. When he came back up, he handed me his invoice and then paused with his hand on the door frame and said something that I have thought about every day since. He said, and I remember this exactly, "You got someone staying with you down there?" I said no. I told him I lived alone. He nodded slowly and said he must have been mistaken. He left. I stood in my kitchen for a moment and then I went to the basement door and stood at the top of the stairs and listened. I heard nothing. I told myself he had seen something innocuous, a sleeping bag I'd stored down there at some point, a pile of moving blankets. I didn't go down. I closed the door and locked it from the kitchen side and sat on the couch and watched television until it was late enough to justify going to sleep. I didn't sleep. The next morning I called my neighbor Dave, who I'd gotten friendly with over the summer. I asked him to come over. I told him I thought I might have a raccoon or something living in the basement and I didn't want to go down alone. He came over that afternoon with a flashlight and a baseball bat and we went downstairs together. The main area was exactly as I'd left it. Boxes. The old bicycle I never rode. A folding table leaned against the wall. We moved toward the utility room. Dave pushed the door open with the bat. He reached in and found the light switch and the bare utility bulb came on and we looked at what was in front of us. Behind the water heater, tucked into the corner in the space between the tank and the wall, was a living space. That is the only way I can describe it. Whoever had been there had arranged the space with a kind of quiet, methodical domesticity that made it somehow worse than if it had been chaotic. A sleeping pad, the thin foam kind sold for camping, rolled out on the concrete. A wool blanket folded neatly on top of it. A small battery lantern switched off and set upright beside a paperback book with a library bookmark in it. A water bottle. A Ziploc bag containing crackers and 2 granola bars. A change of clothes folded in a small pile. And a small hand mirror, propped against the wall, facing the sleeping pad. Dave and I stood in the doorway and didn't speak for a long time. Then he said quietly, "This isn't an animal. They took the items from behind the water heater as evidence." The library book was traced to a Minneapolis public library branch 6 blocks from my house. It had been checked out under a name that did not match any record in the system. A false name. A card taken out with false identification. They never found who it was. The case is technically still open. I was told it is unlikely to result in an arrest at this point. I have since moved. I live in an apartment now, on the 4th floor, with no basement. When I told this story to a friend recently, she asked me what the worst part was. I told her it wasn't the discovery. It wasn't the police. It wasn't even the realization that someone had been 10 feet below me every night for months while I lay in bed thinking I was alone. The worst part was the mirror. Propped against the wall, facing the sleeping pad. Because whoever was down there had wanted to see themselves before they slept and when they woke up. Which means they were a person. A full, complete person living in the dark space beneath my home, eating crackers and reading library books by battery light and looking at their own face in a hand mirror in the corner behind my water heater. And I have never been able to stop thinking about what expression was on that face. My grandmother used to say that in cold country, the ground remembers. She meant it as a kind of poetry, the way the land holds the shape of what was taken from it, the way old mines leave the hills slightly hollow, the way the earth above them sometimes sinks years after the last cart of coal came up. She didn't mean it literally. But after what happened in the house I grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, I'm not so sure she was speaking in metaphor. Our house was built in 1941 by my great-grandfather on land his family had owned since the turn of the century. It was a wood frame house, wide and low, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and a root cellar dug beneath the kitchen that my family had always used as a basement. Dirt floor, timber supports, a single entry through a wooden hatch in the kitchen floor. My grandmother stored her canning down there, rows of mason jars on wooden shelves, pickled vegetables and fruit preserves and tomato sauce from her garden. It smelled like vinegar and soil and old wood. It smelled like every house I've ever felt safe in. At the far end of the root cellar there was a door. A heavy wooden door in the stone foundation wall, reinforced with a metal crossbar that rested in two iron brackets bolted to the frame. My great-grandfather had built it into the original construction. We were told it opened into a storage area he had excavated himself, extra space for equipment, my grandfather said. Nobody in my family had ever opened it. The crossbar was rusted solid in its brackets by the time I was old enough to notice the door. I grew up understanding that it was a feature of the house, like the creak in the third porch step or the window in the upstairs bathroom that would only open halfway. Just part of the place. Nothing to question. I was 13 when my cousin Marcus, who was 15 and had recently decided that rules were suggestions, decided to open it. It took both of us 40 minutes to break the rust on the crossbar enough to lift it. We used a hammer and a can of WD-40 Marcus had taken from the garage. We worked in the low yellow light of the single bulb that hung from the ceiling joist, surrounded by my grandmother's canning jars, and when the crossbar finally lifted free of its brackets we both stood there for a moment before Marcus pulled the door open. Cold air came out. Not the natural cold of the root cellar, something much deeper, much older. The kind of cold that comes from a place where sunlight has never reached. And beyond the door there was not a storage room, there was a tunnel. A mine tunnel. 6 feet wide, 5 feet tall, timber supported, stretching into darkness in both directions, one direction running roughly north, one direction running south toward the hill our house sat at the base of. The floor was packed earth with rusted rail lines half buried in it. Old coal cart tracks. The timber supports along the walls were thick, old-growth beams, and some of them had shifted over the decades so they leaned slightly inward, creaking when the air moved through from whatever opening existed somewhere far in the darkness. And the walls, the stone walls between the timbers, were covered in marks. Scratches. Tallies. Dates. Names. We stood in the doorway and neither of us went in. Even Marcus, who had dragged us down here against my better judgment, did not go in. We stood there reading the names scratched into the stone and neither of us said a word. Some of the names had single dates beside them. Not birth dates. Just one date. The date they stopped being written. We went upstairs and didn't talk about it until dinner. and at dinner Marcus told my grandmother what we'd found. She set her fork down. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told us about the Harlan shaft collapse of 1927. 11 men had been working a seam in the hill behind our property when the ceiling of the shaft collapsed on a Tuesday morning in October. The company, a coal operation that had sold the mineral rights to the land decades before my great-grandfather bought it, had sent rescue teams in twice. Both times the teams had to retreat. The shaft was too unstable. The men were never recovered. The opening of the mine had been sealed with concrete and the company had moved its operation 3 miles east and never returned. My grandmother had known about the tunnel her entire life. Her father-in-law, my great-grandfather, had discovered it when he was digging the root cellar. He had broken through the foundation wall into it accidentally, realized what it was, and built the door and the crossbar. He never told anyone outside the family. He believed the men deserved to be left in peace. 11 men. In a collapsed shaft that connected, through some network of tunnels I never fully mapped, to our basement. To the place where my grandmother kept her canning. To the place where Marcus and I had spent 40 minutes breaking a rusted crossbar while cold air seeped under the door from a darkness that no one had disturbed in 60 years. We never opened that door again. When my family sold the house in 2004, my mother told the buyers about the tunnel and they had the door professionally sealed from the root cellar side, new concrete, steel plate, the works. The buyers later told us they did not want to know what was on the other side. They just wanted it shut. I think about those names on the wall sometimes. Scratched into stone by men who knew, at some point, that the rescue wasn't coming. That the darkness was going to be permanent. I think about them every time I walk into a basement and feel that specific cold that has no business being there. The cold that comes from somewhere much deeper than the foundation, from somewhere the sunlight gave up on a long time ago. My grandmother was right. The ground remembers. And sometimes, if you open the wrong door, it tells you exactly what it hasn't forgotten.